Welcome to Our Culture to the World. I'm Melva Persico. Come with me, meet new people, and learn from their experiences in this episode of Our Culture to the World. Our guest today is Gugu Selela. Gugu, go ahead and tell us about yourself.
Thank you very much, Melba, for inviting me to your platform. My name is Gugu Selela. I am from South Africa. I grew up in Durban, which is close, which we share the Indian Ocean with Tanzania and Kenya. I studied in South Africa for my undergraduate, my master's in the University of KwaZulu-Natal, Howard College in Durban. Then when I started working, I moved to Johannesburg, which is like the economic hub of South Africa. So the country that I'm from, it's located in the southern African region. Although my country, South Africa, sometimes people get confused with the region. Yes, it's kind of the same, but we call Southern Africa, which is the region, and our neighbor countries like Botswana, Swaziland, and we have a country inside South Africa, Lesotho, and then other neighboring countries is Namibia, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe.
Okay. So, Gugu, what brought you to the US?
Okay, I came to the US to study my PhD in policy studies in Clemson. So currently I am gonna start my fourth year this coming fall. So I'm a PhD candidate in political science department, but the program is policy studies. So I focus on gender-based violent policies, but looking at the Black feminist approach. As we know, especially here in the US, Black women have the highest stat when it comes to gender-based violence. So my study looks at whether when they're formulating these policies, do they consider theories of Black feminism, which specifically focuses on Black women's experiences? So that is what my study looks at.
Okay. Very interesting. And I know that you also, as you're studying, but you're also teaching as well.
Yes, that is true. So I'm an instructor of record for two departments, the Department of Political Science, as well as the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies. And the program which I'm teaching is Women's Leadership. So in the Women's Leadership, I teach courses like Women in Global Perspective, Gender and Sexuality, Introduction to Women's Studies. And then in the political science, I teach African politics as well as gender and politics, which is also aligned to what I am doing with my research. So I'm grateful to teach something that is very close to my research interest.
Exactly. You can draw from one into the other.
Yeah. Exactly. Yes, that's true.
So coming to the US to study, was this your first time coming to the United States, or had you traveled here before?
Oh, yes, I've been to the US because my partner was studying in San Diego. So when I used to come and visit while I was still working in South Africa to visit them. And so yeah, I've been to the West Coast and I was not exposed to the southern part of the US. So I assumed the whole USA is like the Western coast. So that was like a culture shock for me.
Then tell us about that culture shock.
Well, okay, I really assumed the culture is the same, the traditions and everything that is done in the US is similar. Because I spent every time I started visiting the US in 2018, and I just assumed, okay, everywhere. So when I now applied to Clemson, which is in the southern, and I came, I was like, wow, the food is different, the way people behave. Of course, the history is quite different, which I have learned even when I was back in South Africa, but I didn't know that it was this visible in all regions, whether you're in the Midwest, whether you're in the South, there is those traces of the historical background of the USA. So that was quite interesting for me, especially the food in the South was like, wow, okay.
Okay, so you had to learn to learn to negotiate things like the green beans and the macaroni and cheese and the fried chicken.
I'm still negotiating. I'm still negotiating with that because the interesting thing with the South, most of their dishes come from like West Africa, and I'm in the southern region, and we eat different dishes. So I think that's because in the south they eat okra. We don't eat okra in southern Africa, in South Africa specifically. So I know my West African friends, they feel more comfortable with the dishes in the south, but for me, I'm still really struggling with the southern dishes.
Oh,
While with California, they mostly eat avocado, and they're very particular with their diet.
okay, okay. Yes, yes, yes. You can put on a few pounds when you come to the South.
And I did. Big time.
Tell me about it.
Yes.
A constant struggle.
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
Yeah. Yes. So now, Nigo, interacting with Americans, I'm pretty sure that some Americans, not necessarily those in the university, in academia, but maybe others that you may have had contact with, may have had certain stereotypes about South Africa and South African culture. Did you encounter any of those?
Oh, yes, I did. Even within the Clemson environment university, there were some droplets. Again, I think because my country has Africa in it. So whenever I say I'm from South Africa, they say, which country? I'm like, South Africa. Then I have to like make reference to like Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, for them to, as a reference. But yes, or sometimes I'll have people, whether in the public space, they will be like, oh, I have a friend in Kenya. Do you know them? Not knowing that Africa is a continent, not a country. So I get that a lot. People asking me, oh, I have a friend in Cameroon. Do you know them? Like, it's the same as here in the US, because US is quite big. So yeah, so I think for me, those are the things that I encounter. And also thinking when it comes to development, like Africa is not developed. It's our first time being exposed to roads. This assumption that we are always with the animals, we're in the safari, we stay in huts, which is not the case. And often I always remind even my students, like when it comes to certain policies, especially in South Africa, because we're still the youngest democracy. And we, for example, the same-sex marriage, we had it in 1996 before the US. So every time I share that, my students always get surprised. So there are some progressive policies and things in Africa, but of course the media portrays our continent very different.
Yes, yes.
And I would assume even with the Caribbeans, especially the global South region, whether it's Asia, where it's least economically progressive.
Exactly, exactly. Yes, yes. I mean, and it's good that you have been, you're able to dispel some of those stereotypes when you interact with others. Yes.
Yeah.
So we touched a little bit on your the shock of moving to the south, coming to the southern
Right.
part of the United States. And how I know you're still adapting, right? So how has it been adapting to this different culture?
It's been very interesting. I've been learning a lot about myself and also just social behavior or human behavior. One of the things is I'm from South Africa. In South Africa, we have white people, but they're a minority. So it's like the opposite of the US, where you have the Black people who are a minority here. So it's still hard for me to maneuver in spaces where I am a minority, because even when I go home, I went home last summer. So when I come back, I need to adjust that I'm in spaces where I could be the one or two Black people or person of color. So those are some of the things that I still struggle with, but there are some similarities when it comes to the racial inequality compared to South Africa and the US. We both have that, but the irony is that in South Africa, Black people are a majority, but they are still very much not equal to the minority of the white. So spaces, being in white spaces and adjusting to that, and also having to speak only English, because in South Africa, we have 11 official languages. So we always, even when we speak in English, we code switch. And since we have 11 official languages and most are native languages. So yeah, that's another thing that I need to try to I have to speak English throughout. I don't have to code switch. So yeah, that is something that I'm still struggling with. Because as a South African, we're very proud of our languages, and it's a more of a decolonial mindset for us to speak our native languages. So in any way, any opportunity given, when I meet a South African or a Southern African, I would actually speak my native languages.
So tell me, I want to expand on that a little bit, because you mentioned 11 official languages. So, and can you speak all?
Not all, but almost more than 5.
Okay. And those languages are regional or
Historically,
depending on ethnicity?
oh yes, it belongs to different ethnic groups. And historically, during the apartheid, every region was sort of categorized with the different languages. But of course, till today, we still have those traces. Like I'm from KwaZulu-Natal. And in KwaZulu-Natal, it's where the Zulu people are. And that's where King Shaka, like the history of King Shaka's sort of people. So when you go to KwaZulu-Natal, it's very much common that most people will speak isiZulu, including Indians and white. Then if you go to the Eastern Cape, where Nelson Mandela is from, they speak Xhosa. But the dialects are similar. Xhosa and Zulu, they are part of the Nguni languages. So the Nguni languages is Xhosa, Zulu, Swati, Ndebele. And those ones, even if we understand each other, it's just different dialects. Right. And then you go to the up north, where you'll have people who speak Tonga, Shivenda, and then on the west side, they will speak Xhosa, Sesotho. So it's still, but big cities, you find a mixture of everyone. Yeah. So in Johannesburg, Cape Town, Durban, you will find a mixture, just I guess the same as New York and those big cities here in the US.
Yes. So, and of course, it helps to be able to be multilingual.
Oh yes, definitely. Yeah. I think that's what's also another culture shock, actually discovering people only speak one language here. I was like, oh, yeah.
Yes. Okay. So we know, there are differences, but have you been able to detect or experience any similarities or connections between life in the US and life in South Africa?
That's a good one. One of the things in the South, they have some level of humanity, and we call that Ubuntu. I am because we are. So there's that community in the South, despite its history, but still people will greet, people will help you, which is different from the West Coast, because in the West Coast, it's very individualistic. You just focus on your own thing. So coming back to the South, it reminded me of home, because in any space, especially since I'm from KwaZulu-Natal, anywhere you go, whether it's the restroom, anywhere, you need to greet. You're using a public transport, you greet, you share everything. So that's the similarities that I saw in the South. Like, wow, their lifestyle is kind of similar. They use also food as their love language, which we also use. So any household you go to in the South, people, feed you, which is very much common in South Africa and Africa as a whole. And the greeting and the communal setting is one thing that I like in the South. But of course, in other parts of the US, when I travel, especially the big cities, I still struggle with the fact that people you can walk past, you don't greet them and all of that.
Yes, I understand that, like we're from Guyana, Caribbean culture, South Africa, South America. But the whole thing about greeting, we were used to, and then we lived in Miami for 7 years, and from Miami we moved here, and so I think my husband is still getting used to the greeting. So like we might drive past somebody, and the person would wave, and he would be asking, "Who's that?"
Exactly.
You don't know the party. I said, "Listen, it's the Southern wave. It's the Southern.
Yes,
Just gotta
I
say
love
hello."
it. I love the Southern hospitality.
Yeah. So as we continue, now I know there are other, we have the whole African continent, and you're from South Africa. Have encountered other persons from the African continent, and how is your interaction in terms of seeing or experiencing similarities or differences in worldview between yourself as a South African and other Africans from the continent?
Okay. So one of the things is I studied also international relations. So in my class in South Africa, most of my colleagues were other Africans, like we're from Tanzania, Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, my neighboring countries, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and so on. So most of my friends, because I studied with them, most of my friends are not South Africans. And my partner is Mozambican. So I'm very much exposed, and I've stayed in Botswana, worked in Zambia, Namibia. So I'm very much exposed with the African continent, and especially the southern region, because I've worked outside South Africa. So one of the differences, of course, it's the food. Sometimes it's the culture, because in South Africa, respect is very important. Like it's like the centerpiece. And some similarities I know in West Africa and East Africa, respect is very important. But interesting enough, there are certain, again, because in Africa we were colonized by different colonial masters, that is always, they always leave traces. So if countries that were colonized by the Lusophones, the Portuguese, they have a different way of their lifestyle and how they respect and courtesy, even with the Francophones that were colonized by the French. And then we find more similarities with those that were colonized by the British, because we share similar colonial masters. So those are some of the things that we see. But also South Africa, we are 30 years in democracy. One thing about South Africans, we are very expressive. So compared to most African most Africans, in any space, even here in the US, that I noticed when I meet South Africans, they're very vocal, because we are still a young democracy and we still have that fight. So we always against inequality, we always against mistreatment or discrimination, and so because that is very much close to home, which is quite different with other Africans, because they had their independence in like 60 years, 50 something. So they always call us like the child within the continent, because we are always ready to fight. While for them, they are all now, they're just like, it is, Kesera.
Yeah, well,
yes. Yeah, so
done that.
yeah, so sometimes they will make jokes like, we are so spoiled, we want everything, like South Africans, we are so vocal, and also South Africa being quite liberal compared to other African countries, in terms of our policies, our lifestyle, for example, the LGBTQ plus, and we know that in most African countries, it's just anti-LGBTQ plus. When it comes to even gender equality and so on, of course, we have countries like Rwanda, but when it comes to freedom of speech, is something that we express more than other. And I noticed that when I travel to other African countries, and sometimes by the immigration officer, they will remind us like, hey, this is not South Africa, so you better behave. So yeah.
Yeah. So what about any opportunities you have had to share your home culture with people you interact with in the States?
Oh, the fact that I teach African politics, so I get to bring African experts to my classroom to panel discussions with my students, engage with my students. And in my African politics class, beginning of each, like when I start my first semester, what I do is my students randomly select a country out of the 54. Well, we add 55, the Western Sahara. So they get to learn about the different countries and also dispel certain assumptions they have about Africa. So having to teach women in global perspective, where I get to bring women in the global South, from the Caribbean to Asia to Africa, is something that I'm very much privileged and appreciate that I have that opportunity at Clemson to also share my knowledge, because my style or my teaching philosophy is ensuring that there's inclusivity in spaces of academia, especially to us who were historically excluded. So having those opportunities and my curriculum teaching such is my space where I get to engage with the Americans.
Okay. And how how have the students that you've interacted with, how have they received, these new experiences that they receive, that they get in your class?
Oh, wow. At the beginning, of course, one thing I do ask them, like, when you hear of Africa, what do you think? And of course, they're like, they get babies with flies, hearts, all the stereotypical what Africa is.
And the
By
media
the,
puts out there.
exactly. And then by the end of the semester, they'll come to me like, wow, and some actually have been to now to African countries after taking my course. So the fact that they are now even interested to learn more, because they also speak about how they don't learn much outside the US curriculum. So it's always good to even hear them like, oh, I actually went to South Africa. Oh, I was in Kenya. So yeah, they do reach out after and tell me that they've actually visited certain countries that we have studied in class. So that is always exciting.
Good. Yes, of course, of course. What has been your most impactful experience from living abroad?
Oh, that's a good question. I think one of the having to be a voice for not just South Africa, but also for the Southern region, having to be invited to speak in platforms where often the global South had not received. So having a panel, which I attended last year or this year, I can't remember, it was the Global Feminist panel, and I was part of the panelists, and having to see other countries in the global south been given the platform compared to most of the time when we think of experts, we think of the global north and people who are more clued up when it comes to issues, especially when it comes to gender issues or feminism. So having that opportunity to even contribute in Clemson when it comes to curriculum, even within the women's leadership program, where I get to develop syllabus and also sort of structure it where the voices of the global South women are heard. Because when we speak of, in my field, especially the gender studies, we always look at the Eurocentric or the Western feminism. So just having those opportunities to amplify the Afrofeminism, Black feminism in these spaces and include them in the curriculum means so much to me.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes, of course. So now you've shared quite a bit as we've spoken about your country and your country's culture, but is there anything else that you'd like to share about South Africa and its people and cultures that you haven't touched on before?
Okay, we love fun. We love having fun. We like to party. We love to have fun. I know in Africa, because of the whole xenophobia, but when you go to South Africa, we are the most friendly and welcoming nation. The only thing is just that South Africans don't like being disrespected. But besides that, what can I also share? Good or bad, or
whatever you think.
I think the bad one, because I focus on gender-based violence policies, that's why they're very close to my heart. South Africa is one of the countries that has the highest rate of gender-based violence in the world. And that's something, even when I was here looking at literature, many professors will ask me, like, what could be the reason? Of course, our history, having the apartheid, and also the lifestyle, because we have a high crime rate in South Africa, and we have a high also percentage of unemployed youth. So with that, that's something that which is, I guess, the downside of South Africa. But the positive side is that we love to have a good time. We are very much politically conscious, especially like Black consciousness. Of course, this is based on our history. And yeah, I think that's what I could share about South Africa. They have Ubuntu, which is humanity. We are quite big on Ubuntu. Even in our policies, we actually do incorporate being I am because we are. So everything within our policies, we also have that. So it's not just something that we say or do, but it's also being used and implemented in our administration.
You know what? One of my earlier guests, and I think that might have been probably about 2 years ago, mentioned Ubuntu. I think she was working with the UN in East Africa. And so that was a while back. So why don't you, before we end our conversation, explain in a little more detail what Ubuntu is?
Okay. All right. Can I explain now?
Oh, sure.
All right. So Ubuntu means, and I'll use this phrase, and in East Africa, they call it Ujama, where in South Africa, I'll say it in my native language, Umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu. A person is a person through other people. So the only way you exist in any space is because of other people. And I'm sure you've heard this saying, it takes a village to raise a child. So you belong to a certain community, and whatever you do, you are representing those people. So me being from South Africa, whatever I do here in the US, I am representing South Africa and the people of my continent. So, and Ubuntu is also about sharing and giving, being selfless in everything that you do, and not just considering yourself. Anything that you do, you need to consider of other people. That the reason why I'm even here and having this opportunity, it's not because of just, yes, could be my hard work, but also the community and the society that I come from, where I've learned African philosophies and knowledges that has shaped who I am. So Ubuntu also is placed or belongs to a group of, it's always communal. It's not an individualistic ideology, but it's a community ideology where you say, I cannot exist without other people, which is quite different with the Western concept, because the Western concept actually encourages you to be an individual, to do things on your own. But if you think, that's another thing, a culture shock was, back home, you can't spend a month just being alone and not speak to anyone. While here, you can do that. You can do things on your own and still be absolutely fine. Well, back home, you can't. You have to interact with people. You have families who come without uninvited, all of those things. Those are some of, I guess, the characters of Ubuntu, where you just welcome people, welcome strangers. And often, there are times where we critique Ubuntu, especially when we look at colonialism, because when the colonizers came, because Africans have that thing of welcoming strangers, and then of course they took advantage, and then we had colonialism. So those are some of the things. Sometimes it has its negativity, where we get exploited as a continent, because we are very welcoming. We take everyone, wherever you are from, and so on.
Okay, thank you. And that's such a good note to end on. That it's an aspect of culture that's so important, I mean, and it just shows the differences, but not individualistic, but more communal and more taking others into consideration. And that you're not just an island, but you're part of a larger community.
Exactly, that is absolutely true.
Yes. So Gugu, it was such a pleasure talking with you, our guest Gugu Selela, and want to continue to wish you all the best. I know you're coming down to the end of your studies, and thanks for being a part of our culture to the world and for sharing experiences about life in South Africa and how you have been able to negotiate, and how you are negotiating this new culture in which you find yourself.
All right. Thank you so much for inviting me and giving me, being part of this platform and sharing my experiences in the US, and also sharing my continent, my region, and my country. So thank you for this opportunity. And I hope people will learn something about Southern Africa or South Africa.
You're welcome. And to the viewers, thank you so much for watching. We're going to see you soon as we meet more people and learn from their experiences in our next episode of Our Culture to the World.